The first wave came at 7:48 a.m. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, circling above Pearl Harbor in the lead aircraft, surveyed the American Pacific Fleet spread below him like toys in a bathtub. 8 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, rows of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on the airfields. He raised his signal flare and gave the order that would change the world. Tora, Tora, Tora. Within 2 hours, 2,403 Americans would be dead. The Pacific Fleet would lie in ruins, and the United States would be catapulted into a war that would reshape global history. For decades, the story has been told as a tale of Japanese treachery and American innocence, a day of infamy that came without warning. But the real story is far more complex, far more tragic, and reveals truths about empire, resources, and the machinery of war that echo into our present day. This is not the story you learned in school. The myth of isolation. In 1941, most Americans believed their country stood apart from the world's conflicts. We were protected by 2 vast oceans. We had no imperial ambitions in Asia. We were merely observers to the madness consuming Europe and China. This was a comfortable fiction. By 1941, American economic and strategic interests stretched across the Pacific like an invisible web. The Philippines had been an American colony since 1898, seized from Spain in a war that was itself born of imperial ambition. Wake Island, Midway, Guam, scattered dots on the map that formed a chain of American power projection deep into Asian waters. And beyond these formal possessions lay something even more significant: the economic architecture of Asian-Pacific trade. American companies controlled vast rubber plantations in Southeast Asia. American oil companies operated throughout the Dutch East Indies. American banks financed trade throughout the region. When Japan looked at the Pacific, they didn't see American neutrality. They saw American empire, just conducted through different mechanisms than their own. Captain Hideo Hirade, a mid-level officer in the Japanese Naval Intelligence, wrote in his diary in early 1941, "The Americans claim they have no territorial ambitions in Asia, yet their dollars control more of our region than the armies of Britain or France. Is economic occupation somehow more moral than military occupation?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the conflict. The resource trap. To understand why Japan attacked America, you must first understand the trap Japan found itself in. A trap partly of its own making, but also engineered by the very structure of the global economy. Japan in 1941 was a nation paradoxically powerful and desperately vulnerable. It had the 3rd largest navy in the world, a battle-hardened army, an industrial capacity that rivaled European powers. Yet, it possessed almost none of the resources needed to sustain modern warfare. The statistics were staggering. Japan imported 88% of its oil, 90% of its steel-making materials, 100% of its rubber, and 60% of its rice. For a nation with imperial ambitions, this dependence was existential terror. Every ship, every plane, every bullet depended on resources Japan didn't have. And here's what American textbooks rarely emphasize: the vast majority of these resources came from or flowed through territories controlled by Western powers, primarily Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. Oil was the most critical. In 1941, the United States supplied approximately 80% of Japan's oil imports. The next largest source was the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, controlled by a Netherlands government in exile after German occupation. Britain controlled access to Malayan rubber and Burmese resources. France controlled Indochina's rice and minerals, though by 1940, Vichy France had been forced to grant Japan access. This meant Japan's economic survival depended on the goodwill of nations whose colonial possessions surrounded Japan like a noose. The wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The war with China was supposed to be quick. When Japanese forces moved beyond their puppet state of Manchukuo in 1937 to attack China proper, military planners predicted victory in 3 months. 4 years later, they were still fighting, and the China campaign had become a festering wound that drained Japanese resources and international goodwill. The Rape of Nanking in December 1937, where Japanese forces massacred between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians, shocked the world. Photographs and newsreels of atrocities turned international opinion sharply against Japan. American missionaries witnessed the horrors firsthand and sent accounts home. The romanticized image of Japan as an exotic, refined culture began to crumble. But here's what gets lost in simplified narratives. American and British business interests continued trading with Japan throughout the early China conflict. Banks continued extending credit. Oil continued flowing. The moral outrage was real, but so was the profit motive. This changed slowly, then all at once. In July 1939, the United States gave Japan 6 months. Notice that it would abrogate the 1911 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation, the legal framework governing trade between the two nations. In practical terms, this meant America could now legally restrict exports to Japan. The restrictions came in waves. First, aircraft parts and aviation fuel, then scrap metal and steel. Each new restriction was justified by Japan's actions in China, but each also pushed Japan closer to a terrible choice: abandon its war in China or seek alternative sources of resources in Southeast Asia, which meant confronting Western colonial powers. The psychology of humiliation, a dimension to this story that statistics and policy papers miss. The psychological warfare being waged through economics. From the Japanese perspective, the Western powers' response to their actions in China reeked of hypocrisy. Britain had built its empire through violence and exploitation. France controlled Indochina through military force. The Netherlands ruled Indonesia with an iron fist. The United States had just a generation earlier seized the Philippines and conducted a brutal counterinsurgency that killed hundreds of thousands. Yet when Japan sought to build its own imperial sphere, what it termed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, it was condemned as uniquely barbarous. Lieutenant Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, a radical officer who would later play a key role in the Pacific War, wrote in 1940, "The white man tells us we may not do what he has done for 3 centuries. This is not morality. This is racial supremacy disguised as ethics. They wish to keep Asia divided and weak, forever a source of cheap resources and captive markets. This worldview was self-serving and failed to acknowledge Japanese atrocities as anything other than equivalents to Western colonial violence. But it was also not entirely wrong about Western motivations. The colonial powers had no intention of granting independence to their Asian territories. Their moral objection to Japanese expansion was inseparable from their material interest in maintaining their own empires. The economic restrictions weren't just policy. They were perceived as racial humiliation. That perception, whether accurate or not, influenced decisions made in Tokyo as much as any strategic calculation. The fatal moves of 1940 to 1941. In September 1940, Japan made a decision that sealed its fate. It signed the tripartite pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. On the surface, this was a defensive alliance. In reality, it transformed the separate conflicts in Europe and Asia into a potential global war. The pact contained a clause specifically aimed at the United States. The 3 powers agreed to support one another if attacked by a nation not presently involved in the European War or the Sino-Japanese conflict. Everyone knew this meant America. President Roosevelt and his advisors now faced a strategic nightmare. If they continued pressuring Japan economically, Japan might strike south into British and Dutch territories. If Britain fell to Germany and Japan seized Southeast Asian colonies, the United States would face a 2-ocean war against a hostile coalition controlling the resources of 3 continents. The American response was to turn the economic screws tighter. In July 1940, the Export Control Act gave the president sweeping authority to restrict exports. Aviation fuel was immediately embargoed. In September, all scrap metal exports to Japan were banned. Each month brought new restrictions, but the truly fatal blow came in July 1941, the oil embargo, point of no return. On July 24, 1941, Japanese forces completed their occupation of southern French Indochina. This move put Japanese forces within striking distance of Singapore. The Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. The Roosevelt administration decided this was the line that could not be crossed. On July 26th, the United States froze all Japanese assets in America. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed suit. In practical terms, this created a complete oil embargo. Japan could no longer purchase oil from its primary sources. This was the moment that made war virtually inevitable. Japan's oil reserves would last approximately 18 months. Less with active military operations. The naval fuel oil necessary for the combined fleet would run out even sooner. As Admiral Nagano Osami told Emperor Hirohito, "We are now like a patient with a serious illness. The longer we wait to have surgery, the weaker we become. If we must fight now." Here's the crucial point. American policymakers understood this would likely lead to war. They were not naive. Secretary of State Cordell Hull wrote in his memoirs that the administration knew Japan might lash out with all the fury of a cornered tiger. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote in his diary that the question became how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot. This doesn't mean America caused Pearl Harbor or deserved attack, but it does mean the surprise was not as complete as popular history suggests. The Roosevelt administration had made a calculated decision: pressure Japan into either backing down or starting a war that would bring America into the global conflict. The November deadline. In the late summer and fall of 1941, Japanese leadership engaged in agonized debate. The government was not monolithic. It was split between different factions with competing visions. The Navy, led by officers like Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, was deeply skeptical of war with America. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity. His famous warning was not bravado, but genuine concern. "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." The Army, especially its radical junior officers, pushed for aggressive action. They had spent years fighting in China and saw compromise as weakness. Many believed racial destiny gave Japan the right to lead Asia. The civilian government, led by Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro, desperately sought compromise. Konoe proposed a face-to-face meeting with Roosevelt to negotiate a settlement. The meeting never happened. Roosevelt's advisors, particularly Hull, believed Japan could not be trusted to honor agreements. By October 1941, Konoe's government fell. General Tojo Hideki, the army minister, became prime minister. But even Tojo initially continued seeking diplomatic solutions. Throughout November, negotiations continued in Washington between Japanese Ambassador Nomura Kichisaburo and Secretary Hull. Japan's final proposal, delivered November 20th, asked for restoration of oil exports, no U.S. interference in Japan's war with China, recognition of Japan's special position in Indochina. In return, Japan offered to withdraw from southern Indochina and promise no further expansion. The American counter-proposal, delivered November 26 and known to history as the Hull Note, demanded complete withdrawal from China and Indochina, recognition of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, withdrawal from the Tripartite Pact. To Japanese leadership, these terms amounted to surrender. After 4 years of war and tens of thousands of casualties, they would have to abandon everything achieved in China. The military would be humiliated. The government might fall to radical elements. On December 1st, 1941, an imperial conference made the final decision. Japan would go to war. The strategy no one expected. Here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Japanese planners never expected to win a long war with America. That was never the goal. The strategy, conceived primarily by Yamamoto, was audacious and deeply flawed. Japan would strike a massive blow against American power in the Pacific, destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet and seizing a defensive perimeter of resource-rich territories. American will to fight would crumble. The U.S. public, still largely isolationist, would pressure Roosevelt to negotiate peace. Japan would be recognized as the dominant power in Asia, and both sides would return to their respective spheres. This strategy rested on a catastrophic misunderstanding of American psychology and politics. Japanese planners assumed Americans were soft, commercial people who would not endure a long, costly war for principles, rather than direct territorial defense. They believed the plural nature of American democracy meant indecisive, weak leadership. They convinced themselves that a nation of immigrants and competing interest groups could not sustain the unity needed for total war. Every assumption was wrong. What Japanese leadership failed to understand was that Pearl Harbor would not break American will, it would forge it. The attack on what Americans saw as unprovoked aggression would transform isolationist sentiment overnight. The very diversity Japan saw as weakness would become strength as Americans of every background united against a common threat. The intelligence that wasn't shared, one of history's great what-ifs, involves American intelligence in the months before Pearl Harbor. The story typically told is that the attack was a complete surprise. The truth is more complex. American cryptographers had broken Japan's diplomatic codes, the Purple Cipher, by late 1940. Through magic intercepts, U.S. intelligence could read diplomatic communications between Tokyo and Japanese embassies worldwide. They knew tensions were escalating. They knew negotiations were failing. What they didn't know was the specific target or timing of Japan's planned attack. The Japanese Navy used a completely different code system, JN-25, that Americans had only partially penetrated. Moreover, the Pearl Harbor Strike Force maintained strict radio silence during its approach. But there were warnings. On November 27, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall sent a war warning to Pacific commanders. On December 3rd, U.S. intelligence noted that Japan had ordered its embassies to destroy code machines, usually a sign of imminent war. The question that haunts historians: did Roosevelt know Pearl Harbor would be attacked and allow it to happen to bring America into the war? The overwhelming evidence says no. While Roosevelt wanted a reason to enter the war against Germany, he expected Japan to attack British or Dutch targets, giving him political cover to invoke mutual defense obligations. The catastrophe at Pearl Harbor was as shocking to the White House as to the public. However, there was negligence. Warnings were not properly distributed. Army and Navy intelligence didn't coordinate effectively. Commanders in Hawaii were not given the full picture of how dire the situation had become. This wasn't conspiracy. It was bureaucratic failure. The people history forgot. In telling the story of Pearl Harbor, we focus on leaders and policies, ships and battles, but there were millions of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by these decisions, whose voices deserve hearing. Takashi Yamamoto, no relation to the admiral, was a second-generation Japanese-American farmer in California. In his diary, discovered decades later, he wrote in late November 1941, "The white men in town look at me differently now. I have lived here 30 years. My children were born here, but I see suspicion in their eyes. If war comes, what will happen to us?" What happened, of course, was internment. 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, forced into concentration camps. It was one of the great injustices in American history, born partly from genuine security fears, but mostly from racism that had simmered beneath the surface for generations. In Tokyo, Masako Ikeda, a school teacher, wrote to her sister in November 1941, "They tell us we may soon be at war with America. The children ask me who the Americans are. I tell them they are people just like us, with families and dreams. But I wonder if anyone in power remembers this." In Washington, Private James Williams, an African-American soldier at Pearl Harbor, later recalled, "People talk about that day bringing Americans together, but that morning, before the attack, I couldn't eat in the same mess hall as the white sailors. After we were attacked, we all bled the same." But that unity didn't last as long as the war. These voices remind us that the grand chess game of empires was played with living pieces. The civilians who saw it coming, not everyone was blind to the approaching catastrophe. Throughout 1941, there were people in both countries who understood where events were leading and tried desperately to change course. Joseph Grew, U.S. ambassador to Japan, repeatedly warned Washington that economic pressure might provoke rather than deter war. In a prescient telegram from February 1941, he wrote, "A progressive squeezing of sanctions is unlikely to lead to a Japanese retreat. We may face the dilemma of either backing down on our principles or facing military action." In Japan, former Foreign Minister Shidehara Kijuro, a moderate who opposed military adventurism, argued that war with America was national suicide. He was ignored, then sidelined, as the military consolidated power. Peace activists in both countries tried to maintain dialogue. American businessmen with Japanese connections worked back channels. Japanese intellectuals published essays calling for restraint. All were swept aside by the momentum of events. Perhaps the most tragic figure was Prince Konoe himself, who genuinely sought compromise but lacked the political strength to stand against the military. After his government fell in October 1941, he wrote, "I have failed complete. The destiny of our nation now rests with those who seek war. The war nobody won. The Pearl Harbor attack achieved tactical surprise, but strategic disaster for Japan. Of the 8 battleships damaged, 6 returned to service. The aircraft carriers, the real power of modern naval warfare, weren't in port. And most crucially, America's industrial base remained untouched. What followed was a war of unprecedented brutality on both sides. The romantic notion that World War II was a good war obscures the reality. Firebombing of cities, atomic weapons, systematic starvation, mass rape, civilian massacres. Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere became a nightmare of occupation and exploitation. The liberation rhetoric was a lie. Japan was simply replacing Western colonialism with its own brutal version. By August 1945, Japan's cities were rubble. Its people were starving. 2 atomic bombs had incinerated over 200,000 civilians. The government that had promised Asian liberation had presided over the deaths of millions of Asians in China, Korea, the Philippines, and throughout Southeast Asia. The United States emerged victorious, but transformed. The small military of 1941 became a permanent warfare state. The innocence Americans imagined they possessed was gone, replaced by the knowledge that they too could commit atrocities in pursuit of victory. The questions that remain: was the Pacific War inevitable? Could different decisions by either side have prevented catastrophe? These are not academic questions. They speak to fundamental issues about how nations relate to one another, how economic pressure becomes violence, and how moral certainty can lead to tragedy. If America had accommodated some Japanese interests in China, would it have encouraged further aggression or prevented war? If Japan had backed down in July 1941, would the military government have survived, or would radical elements have staged a coup? If Roosevelt and Konoe had met face to face, could they have found compromise? We'll never know. What we do know is that once both sides defined the conflict in absolute terms as a zero-sum struggle between incompatible systems, war became the only language they could speak. The hidden reasons beyond good and evil. So what were the hidden reasons Japan attacked America? Not hidden in the sense of secret, but hidden because they complicate the simple story we prefer to tell. Reason 1, resource desperation. This wasn't about expansion for expansion's sake. Japan faced genuine economic strangulation. The embargo created a countdown to national collapse. This doesn't justify the attack, but it explains the calculus that made war seem less risky than slow suffocation. Reason 2, colonial competition. Japan was trying to build an empire in a world already divided by empires. The moral condemnation of Japanese expansion came from nations that had done the same thing. The difference wasn't in the imperial ambition, but in who was doing the expanding. Reason 3, racial dynamics. We rarely discuss how much race shaped the Pacific War. Japanese propaganda emphasized freeing Asia from white colonialism. American propaganda depicted Japanese as subhuman. Both sides saw the conflict partly through racial lenses, making compromise more difficult and atrocities easier to justify. Reason 4, misaligned strategies. America used economic pressure to avoid war while preparing for possible conflict. Japan saw economic pressure as war by other means and chose military action over economic collapse. Neither side understood the other's calculations. Reason 5, domestic politics. In both countries, Leaders faced domestic pressures that limited diplomatic flexibility. Roosevelt couldn't appear to reward Japanese aggression in China without losing political support. Japanese leaders couldn't retreat without facing potential coup by military hardliners. The internal politics of each nation made compromise existentially dangerous for decision-makers. Reason 6. Misreading the enemy. Japan catastrophically misunderstood America. American planners underestimated Japanese resolve and capability. Both sides went to war expecting their assumptions about the enemy to be confirmed, and both were shocked when reality proved different. Lessons for our time. The trap of economic warfare. The path to Pearl Harbor teaches us that economic warfare is still warfare. When nations use economic power to impose unbearable choices on adversaries, violence often follows. The sanctions that seemed like a measured alternative to military conflict became the trigger for military conflict. Today, as major powers use sanctions and economic pressure as primary tools of foreign policy, this lesson remains urgent. Economic coercion can achieve policy goals, but it can also back nations into corners where violence seems like the only escape. The danger of absolute positions. Both America and Japan defined their positions in maximalist terms. America demanded Japan abandon its entire position in China. Japan demanded recognition as Asia's hegemon. Neither would accept anything less than total victory for their core interests. This made compromise impossible. Modern conflicts often repeat this pattern. When nations declare certain outcomes unacceptable and others non-negotiable, they eliminate the space for diplomacy. The blindness of moral certainty. American leaders were certain they were defending principles against aggression. Japanese leaders were certain they were defending their nation's survival and resisting racial oppression. Both were partially right and catastrophically wrong. The lesson isn't moral relativism. Japanese actions in China were genuinely horrific, and stopping aggression was genuinely important. The lesson is that moral certainty can blind nations to the consequences of their actions and the perspectives of their adversaries. The human cost of abstraction. When leaders talk about pressure, sanctions, and strategic necessity, it's easy to forget these are decisions about human lives. The embargo meant not just statistics, but families disrupted, children going hungry, futures erased. The war it triggered killed millions of human beings who had no say in the decisions that determined their fates. The final truth. Here is the hardest truth about Pearl Harbor. It was simultaneously an act of aggression and a predictable response to intolerable pressure. It was both unprovoked and provoked, both surprise attack and anticipated crisis, both moral outrage and logical consequence. This paradox is deeply uncomfortable. We want clear villains and heroes, simple causes and just wars. But history rarely provides such clarity. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a catastrophic miscalculation that led to the deaths of millions. It was also the culmination of years of escalating tension between two powers competing for dominance in the Pacific. It was Japanese aggression and American resistance to that aggression. It was about resources and race, strategy and psychology, rational calculation and catastrophic misunderstanding. Understanding this complexity doesn't excuse the attack. It doesn't make America responsible for Japanese decisions, but it does give us a fuller picture of how nations stumble into catastrophic wars, and perhaps how we might avoid repeating those patterns. As Admiral Yamamoto feared, Japan ran wild for 6 months, then faced the full fury of American industrial might. By the end, both nations had learned bitter lessons about the cost of miscalculation. The question for us, looking back across 8 decades, is whether we've learned those lessons, or whether we're doomed to repeat them with different players and higher stakes. The men who died at Pearl Harbor deserve to be remembered, but they also deserve that their sacrifice lead to wisdom, not just commemoration. Understanding why Japan attacked America, all the hidden reasons, the uncomfortable truths, the complex calculations, is part of honoring their memory. Because the next time great powers face off with incompatible visions and diminishing options, people will die, and they too will deserve better from their leaders than we gave those who fell on December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted 110 minutes. The war it triggered lasted 1,364 days. The lessons, if we choose to learn them, could last forever.